the United Kingdom, France, and China. All other states that join the treaty must do so as non-nuclear weapon states, and there are 185 such parties today. India, Pakistan, and Israel never signed this treaty. Now, in return for a promise not to develop nuclear weapons and agreement to permit intrusive monitoring of peaceful nuclear programs, non-nuclear weapon states received in return a commitment by the nuclear weapon states that they would pursue disarmament and share peaceful nuclear technology. This essentially created a world of nuclear haves and have-nots. Haves and have-nots is fairly divisive language, and much of the world views the nuclear order in those terms. In the decades since the NPT entered force in 1970, both sides have sought to highlight and strengthen the provisions of the treaty that best address their interests. So the nuclear weapon states have sought to use export control mechanisms to raise even higher barriers to the development of nuclear technologies that might contribute to proliferation, while also seeking more stringent monitoring provisions. And the non-nuclear weapon states have sought to broaden the definition of permissible technology sharing while fighting against perceived technology denial regimes. This battle has shaped the global political environment for nuclear energy. Most recently, we've seen it play out in the negotiations with Iran. Here in the United States, those negotiations were viewed as an effort to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. But I can tell you, having traveled around various parts of the world, Iran was seen as a victim of the big powers in many places, and that it was fighting for its legitimate right to peaceful nuclear technology. Again, this view of nuclear haves and have-nots is pervasive. So that brings us to Pakistan and the nuclear order. Now, Pakistan's nuclear program, like that of many other developing countries, started as a nuclear research and energy effort. The Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission was formed in 1956 and opened its first small research reactor supplied by the United States under the Atoms for Peace program in 1965. And in 1971, it inaugurated its first nuclear power reactor supplied by Canada in Karachi. Now, I would expect that you guys would know something about Pakistan's history and would recognize that 1965 and 1971 are seminal dates. And the 1971 war in particular was devastating both politically and psychologically for Pakistan. Now, there are contending narratives about the cause of the war, but the results for Pakistan were clear. The loss of the eastern half of the country, which became an independent Bangladesh, and the capture of some 90,000 Pakistani prisoners of war. This war changed the course of Pakistan's nuclear program, from one that had been essentially peaceful in orientation to one that would provide a deterrent against a perceived existential threat from India. In the view of many Pakistanis, only nuclear weapons would prevent India from inflicting another 1971. To be sure, some in Pakistan prior to 71 had argued that nuclear weapons would be critical to its security. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was the then foreign minister, is famously reported to have declared in 1965, for instance, that if India developed nuclear weapons, Pakistan would eat grass, even go hungry, in order to build its own. When Bhutto became president after the 1971 war, he directed that a nuclear weapons effort begin. And Pakistani officials often cite India's 1974 test of a nuclear device as the impetus for Pakistan's nuclear weapons, noting that India was first to introduce nuclear weapons on the subcontinent. Though true, this is somewhat disingenuous, for the origins of Pakistan's nuclear weapons are clearly rooted in the aftermath of the 71 war. With India having conducted a nuclear test and eschewed joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Pakistan was, in the view of its military chiefs and politicians, left with no choice but to follow suit. Thereafter, Pakistan pursued both the uranium and plutonium paths to the bomb. Until recently, by which I mean about the last decade, uranium was the dominant source of material for Pakistan's nuclear weapons. This is an interesting arc of history, since the initial basis for the program was supposed to be plutonium, but for the arrival of Dr. Abdul Qadir Khan. A.Q. Khan was a Pakistani metallurgist who had trained in Europe and then went to work for the European enrichment firm called Urenco. There he had access to the design blueprints and the lists of parts suppliers, both of which he took to Pakistan in 1974. There he convinced President Bhutto to follow the uranium path at the expense of developing a plutonium option. And despite several setbacks, including an earthquake that did significant damage to the enrichment facility that he had developed, his efforts eventually bore fruit in the 1980s when Pakistan produced enough HEU, highly enriched uranium, for its first nuclear weapons. By 1987, during the brass tacks crisis with India, and again during a subsequent crisis over Kashmir in 1990, Pakistani officials, including Khan himself, made statements in the media that intimated a nuclear weapons capability. At that time, this signaling might have been more bluff than promise, but it demonstrated clearly